There are moments in life when everything you've built, everything you've achieved, and everything you've survived suddenly feels meaningless, because one face, one memory, one name refuses to leave your mind. I stood at the edge of that realization when I understood something simple yet unbearable. Success doesn't erase regret, and no matter how far you go, some apologies don't age. They wait. I still remember the night everything changed. Not because of failure in business, not because of a missed opportunity, but because of a choice I made in the name of ambition. I believed I was building a future. I told myself love would understand. Love would wait, but love doesn't wait forever. And when I finally turned around, she wasn't there anymore. I said things I didn't mean, or maybe I meant them too much in the wrong moment. I chose progress over presence, speed over stillness, logic over emotion. I thought I was being strong, but strength without compassion is just distance wearing a mask, and I created a distance I could no longer cross. The truth is, I never stopped thinking about her. Not in the loud moment or tease of victory, but in the quiet ones no one sees in the middle of empty rooms, in the pauses between conversations, in the nights when everything was finally silent enough for honesty to speak. And honesty always said the same thing. You were wrong and you knew it even then. I don't ask for forgiveness the way people usually do, because some mistakes are not meant to be erased. They are meant to be carried so you never become that version of yourself again. But if she ever hears this, I need her to know I didn't lose her, because I stopped loving her. I lost her because I didn't understand that love is not something you schedule between ambitions. It is the very reason any ambition matters at all. And still, after all this time, I'm sorry. Not for who I became, but for what I failed to protect. For the moments I traded without realizing their value. For believing I had infinite chances in a world that only gives you one real now. If there is one thing I've learned from building, breaking, and rebuilding entire worlds, it's this: you can reconstruct machines, systems, even futures, but you cannot reconstruct a moment that has already chosen to leave you. And so I speak not to or to change the past, but to honor it. Because somewhere in that past, there was a woman I loved deeply, and a version of me who thought time was endless. It wasn't. And that is why, even after all this time, I'm still sorry. I never imagined that silence could echo louder than every achievement I would ever build, but it does. There are moments in life when success feels like it should heal everything, when progress should replace pain, and when ambition should somehow compensate for what was lost along the way. Yet I have learned something far more difficult to accept. No amount of achievement can erase emotional absence, and no level of greatness can rewrite a moment you failed to value when it was right in front of you. I used to believe that if I kept moving forward fast enough, if I kept building, improving, and reaching higher, I would eventually outrun regret. But regret does not chase you. It waits patiently, quietly, until you finally slow down enough to hear it clearly. I still remember the way life felt before everything became complicated by ambition. It was not perfect, but it was real. There was someone who believed in me, not because of what I had accomplished, but because of who I was when I was not trying to be anything extraordinary. And I think that is where I went wrong. I began to confuse building a future with abandoning the present. I told myself that sacrifice was necessary, that distance was temporary, that understanding would come later. But later has a way of turning into never when it comes to people who give their hearts fully and expect honesty in return. I made choices in the name of responsibility, in the name of vision, in the name of becoming someone I thought the world needed me to be. But in doing so, I forgot that the people closest to us are not meant to wait at the edge of our ambitions. They are meant to walk within them. I failed to recognize that love is not a pause button we press and resume when convenient. It is the foundation that gives meaning to every step forward. And when that foundation begins to crack, no structure, no matter how impressive, can remain truly stable. There were nights when everything I had built felt meaningless because the one person I wanted to share it with was no longer there to see it. Not because she stopped caring, but because I made her feel unseen. That realization does not arrive loudly. It comes quietly in moments when everything else is still. When the world stops applauding and you are left alone with your thoughts. And in those moments, honesty becomes unavoidable. I never stopped caring even when I acted like I had moved on. I never stopped remembering even when I pretended to be focused only on the future. And I never stopped regretting the assumption that love could survive without attention, presence, and respect. The truth is, I thought I was strong enough to everything, but I underestimated how fragile emotional trust can be when it is not protected with care. Now, when I look back, I don't see failure in terms of lost opportunities or missed success. I see it in the faces I took for granted, in the conversations I rushed through, and in the moments I believed would always be there waiting for me. And if there is anything I want to say, even if it can never reach the person it was meant for, it is this: I didn't lose love because it disappeared. I lost it because I stopped holding it the way it deserved to be held. And that is why I carry this apology with me even after all this time. There are some regrets that don't fade or ease with time. They refine themselves. They stop being sharp pain and become something heavier, something quieter, something that lives underneath every achievement like a shadow only you can see. I used to think moving forward meant leaving everything behind, but I've learned that some things don't stay behind you. They stay inside you. And no matter how far you go, they move with you, shaping your thoughts, your decisions, even your silence. I remember believing that love could survive anything, even distance, even neglect disguised as dedication. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I built something meaningful enough, if I reached a point where everything made sense, then the person I cared about would understand why I had to step away so often. But what I didn't understand was that understanding is not the same as feeling valued. You can explain your absence 1,000 times, but explanation does not replace presence. And presence is what love quietly depends on. There was a moment when I should have stopped everything. A moment when I should have realized that success without connection is just a beautifully constructed emptiness. But ambition has its own language, or it convinces you that delay is acceptable, that sacrifice is noble, that tomorrow will fix what today is breaking. And I believed it. I believed I was building something that would eventually make everything right again. But life does not reward delayed attention in relationships the way it does in careers. People don't wait for the perfect version of you. They respond to the version of you that shows up now. What I lost was not just a person but a shared reality, a rhythm we once had where even silence felt comfortable because it was filled with understanding. I replaced that rhythm with schedules, with goals, with an endless chase for something I thought would define me. And in doing so, I slowly became someone who was physically present in the world, but emotionally absent where it mattered most. I didn't realize how much damage absence could do when it is repeated enough times to feel normal. At first it was understandable, then it became expected, and finally, it became permanent. That is how distance works. Not all at once, but gradually until one day you look back and cannot find your way to where you once stood together. Even now, after all this time, there are moments when I replay everything in my mind, not to change it because I know I can't, but to understand it. Understanding is the only form of redemption that time allows. I understand now that love is not something that survives on intention alone. It survives on attention, on consistency, on choosing someone even when everything else is demanding your focus. And perhaps the hardest truth I have had to accept is that apologies do not always repair what ambition has broken. Some words arrive too late, not because they are untrue, but because the moment they were needed has already passed beyond reach, leaving only the weight of what could have been said when it still mattered most. There are truths that only become visible after everything is already changed, and by then, they no longer feel like lessons, they feel like consequences. I used to believe I was making decisions that were necessary for growth, for building something larger than myself, something that would justify every sacrifice along the way. But I ever stopped to ask what I was sacrificing, or more importantly, who I was sacrificing in the process. I thought I was trading temporary absence for a permanent job tour. I was wrong. What I created was not just distance, but emotional erosion, slow, quiet, and almost invisible until it was too late to reverse. I still remember the way she used to look at me when everything was simple. There was no expectation of perfection, no demand for constant achievement, only a presence that felt like home. And I did not understand then how rare that kind of presence is. I thought it would always remain unchanged, unaffected by my inconsistency, my delayed replies, my just one more thing excuses that always turned into many more things. I believed love was strong enough to adapt endlessly, but I failed to understand that even the strongest emotions require nourishment. Without attention, even the deepest connection begins to quietly withdraw. There were moments when I felt the shift happening, but I chose to ignore it. Not because I didn't care, but because I convinced myself that I was too close to something important to pause. That is the dangerous illusion ambition creates. It makes you believe that stopping for emotional reality is the same as falling behind in life. So I kept going. I kept building, solving, planning, executing, and enduring. Or so I slowly stopped being present where it mattered most. The irony is that success did come, things worked, systems improved, ideas became reality. From the outside, everything looked like progress, but inside, something was quietly collapsing because no achievement feels complete when there is no one to share the weight of it with, no one to reflect it back to you with genuine warmth. I began to realize that applause from the world cannot replace a single honest conversation with someone who truly knows you. I don't think regret is about wishing you could change the past. It is about finally understanding the depth of what you failed to see when it mattered, and I see it now. I see how often I chose urgency over connection, efficiency over emotion, and progress over presence. I see how many times I assumed tomorrow would be enough to repair what today was slowly breaking. But some things don't wait for repair, they evolve into absence. They become memories instead of moments. And once something becomes a memory, you can no longer hold it. You can only observe it from a distance, wishing you had understood its value while it was still alive in your hands. And so, even now, after everything has settled into time and silence, I carry the same realization with me. I did not lose her in a single moment. I lost her in all the small moments I thought I could afford to miss. And that is the truth I will continue to live with, even after all this time. There are certain realizations that don't arrive like sudden lightning. They build slowly like pressure beneath silence, until one day you can no longer pretend they were never there. I used to think I was managing everything correctly. Ambition, responsibility, relationships, future plans. It all looked balanced from the outside. But what I failed to understand is that life does not measure balance in schedules or achievements. It measures it in presence, attention, and emotional honesty. And in that measure, I was falling behind without even noticing it. I convinced myself that love could withstand anything, especially distance created for a greater purpose. I believed that if my intentions were good enough, my absence would be understood, even forgiven in real time. But I didn't realize that understanding does not erase loneliness. A person can understand why you are not there and still feel the pain of your absence just as deeply. And over time, understanding turns into acceptance, and acceptance slowly turns into emotional withdrawal. There was a version of me that thought working harder meant loving better, as if effort in one area could compensate for neglect in another. I was wrong. Love is not a system that accepts trade-offs. It is not logic that balances input and output. It is fragile in a way ambition often ignores. It requires consistency, not intensity. It requires showing up, not just explaining why you couldn't. And I failed in that consistency far more than I ever admitted to myself at the time. I remember moments when I could have chosen differently, small moments that seemed insignificant then, but now stand out like turning points I walked past without realizing their weight. A message left unanswered because I was busy, a call postponed because I was tired, a conversation shortened because my mind was already elsewhere. Each one felt harmless individually, but together they formed a pattern, and that pattern became distance. Not physical distance at first, but emotional distance. The kind that grows quietly between two people until they no longer speak in the same emotional language. The hardest part to accept is not that I lost something, but that I participated in its loss. It was not sudden, it was not accidental, it was the result of repeated decisions I justified at the time. And now looking back, I can see how each justification was a small step away from something I once considered irreplaceable. Success has a strange way of amplifying what is missing instead of replacing it. The more I achieved, the more I realized there was no one beside me who truly shared the journey in the way it mattered most. Accomplishments felt louder but emptier. Progress felt faster but lonelier. And in those quiet gaps between milestones, regret began to speak clearly for the first time. I don't say this to rewrite history or to ask for something that time has already taken. I say it because clarity comes too late to change outcomes, but not too late to change understanding. And I understand now that being present is not something you do when convenient. It is something you choose repeatedly, even when everything else is demanding your attention. And that is why, even after all this time, the weight of what I failed to protect remains, not as a punishment, but as a reminder of everything I once had and did not realize I was slowly letting go of. There is a strange kind of clarity that only arrives after everything has already changed, when there is nothing left to fix, but everything left to understand. I used to think time was something that could be managed, allocated, optimized, like everything else in life that I tried to build systems around. But emotions don't follow systems, relationships don't obey schedules, and love, real love, does not wait for you to become available. It simply responds to how present you choose to be in the moments that matter. I often replay the illusion I lived in back then, the belief that I could separate ambition from emotion without consequence. I thought I could compartmentalize my life, one part for building, one part for becoming, one part for loving, but life does not respect compartments. It blends everything together quietly until you realize too late that what you thought was balance was actually fragmentation. And in that fragmentation, the most important parts begin to slip through unnoticed. She never demanded perfection. That is what makes the memory or harder to carry. There was no expectation that I'd be flawless, only that I'd be there fully there, not partially present, not mentally elsewhere, not constantly preparing for the next thing while missing the current moment. And I underestimated how valuable that kind of presence is. I thought love was about providing stability, future security, answers, direction, but I now understand it is also about emotional availability in the present tense, and I was rarely there in the way she needed me to be. I remember how easy it was to justify everything at the time, just this project, just this phase, just until things settle. But nothing ever truly settles when ambition becomes the center of gravity. There is always another goal, another milestone, another reason to delay emotional responsibility for later. And slowly, without dramatic conflict or clear breaking points, something quiet begins to disappear. Not suddenly, but gradually enough that you don't notice until you are left trying to remember what it felt like when things were still whole. What hurts most is not the absence itself, but the realization that absence was created through choices I made while believing I was dead or doing the right thing. I thought I was building a future worth sharing. I did not realize I was removing the very person who made that future meaningful in the first place. And by the time I understood that truth, understanding no longer had the power to restore what had already drifted too far. Success continued, life continued, everything externally appeared to move forward as expected, but internally, there was a constant awareness that something essential was missing. No achievement felt complete because there was no one beside me who had experienced the journey with the same emotional depth. It is a strange contradiction to be surrounded by progress, yet feel emotionally incomplete within it. And over time I learned that regret is not loud. It does not announce itself. It becomes a background presence in everything you do, a quiet reminder that some things were not lost suddenly. They were allowed to fade through neglect disguised as purpose. So now when I look back, I no longer ask what could have been done differently in one moment. I understand it was never about a single moment. It was about all the moments I believed could be postponed. And that understanding starts or wise with me, not as something I can change, but as something I can never unlearn, even after all this time. There comes a point in life when you stop searching for excuses and start facing truths you once avoided because they were too uncomfortable to accept. I used to believe that intention mattered more than presence, that as long as my heart was in the right place, the distance I created would somehow be forgiven by time. But time does not interpret intention, it only records impact, and the impact I left behind was not what I thought it would be. I thought love was resilient enough to survive anything, even neglect disguised as ambition. I believed that if I kept building something meaningful, the person I cared about would eventually understand the sacrifices involved. But understanding is not the same as feeling valued, and no amount of explanation can replace the simple reality of being there when it matters. I didn't understand that absence, when repeated often enough, becomes its own language, and that language slowly tells the other person they are no longer a priority. There was a version of me that always believed there would be more time to call, more time to listen, more time to say the things that mattered but were always postponed. But life doesn't store emotional conversations for later. It doesn't pause love until you are ready for it. It moves forward even when you are not emotionally aligned with what you are losing along the way. And I kept assuming I could catch up to the moments I was letting slip through. I remember the silence that began to replace what used to be connection. At first it was subtle, slightly delayed responses, shorter conversations, less emotional depth. I told myself it was temporary, a phase, something that would correct itself once things settled in my world. But what I didn't realize is that emotional distance rarely announces its permanence. It grows quietly until one day you realize you are no longer part of the same emotional space you once shared so naturally. Looking back, I see how many times I prioritized urgency over importance. I chose deadlines over dialogue, progress over presence, and productivity over emotional honesty. At the time it felt justified, even necessary. But now I understand that relationships do not survive on justification. They survive on consistency. And the consistency is something I failed to maintain when it mattered most. Success never filled that gap, it only made it more visible. Every milestone reached felt slightly incomplete, as if something essential was missing from the experience of achievement itself, because there was no one to share the quiet meaning behind it. No one who truly understood the journey and the way it unfolded internally. External validation became louder, but internal fulfillment became quieter, and eventually I stopped confusing movement with progress, because moving forward in life does not always mean moving forward emotionally. Sometimes you are just continuing in a direction while carrying unresolved weight that never truly dissolves. Now I understand something I didn't understand then. Love is not maintained by good intentions alone. It is maintained by attention, by effort in real time, by choosing someone repeatedly in the middle of everything else competing for your focus. And I didn't choose well enough, often enough when it mattered most. So this is not a request to change the past, because I know it cannot be changed. It is an acknowledgement of what was real, what was lost, and what was never fully understood until it was already gone. And even now, after all this time, that understanding remains, not as something I can fix, but as something I will always carry with me. And so when I look back at everything, not with anger, not with denial, but with a clarity that only time can force upon a person, I no longer see a story of success interrupted by loss. I see a story of love quietly displaced by ambition, and ambition later realizing it was never meant to stand alone. The truth is, I once believed that building a future was enough to justify the absence within the present. I thought that if I kept moving forward, If I kept creating something meaningful, then everything I left behind would somehow understand the reasons later. But life does not negotiate with later. It only responds to what we choose in the moment we are living. And in too many of those moments, I chose progress over presence, direction over connection, and certainty over emotional truth. I don't say this as regret that demands correction, but as understanding that demands honesty. Because not every mistake exists to be fixed. Some exist to be remembered, so they are never repeated. I have learned that love does not fail suddenly. It fades quietly through ignored moments, postponed conversations, and emotional distance that slowly becomes normal until normal is no longer enough. What remains now is not a desire to rewrite what happened, but a responsibility to acknowledge what it meant. The silence between two people does not mean the absence of love. It often means the presence of everything that was never said in time, and I carry that silence with me, not as punishment but as awareness. If there is anything this journey has taught me, it is that success without emotional truth is incomplete. Achievement without connection feels hollow, when the moments that mattered most were sacrificed for it. And no matter how far someone goes in life, they cannot outrun the emotional cost of what they chose not to protect.